So let's take a look at the Cooler Master NR200P MAX. Now, if you're familiar with the original NR200P, this should look very, very familiar. In fact, the external is exactly the same. Same size, same volume, same physical dimensions, but the MAX variant comes packaged as a kit, so it has some pre-installed hardware, so the building process and the part selection on your end is a little bit easier. Now, if you're someone who has been considering downsizing to an ITX build, but you don't want to bother with the compatibility of different parts, you're worried about the thermals, and you don't want the building experience to be that difficult, then this is probably the case for you, especially if you're looking to throw in a big power-hungry graphics card. The performance here is pretty incredible. So just like the NZXT H1, the NR200P MAX is a kit. It'll be offered at $350 US, and that kit includes an NR200P, a 280mm liquid cooler, an 850 watt 80 plus gold rated SFX power supply, and a PCIe Gen 4 riser cable. So essentially, Cooler Master are valuing all of those extra bits and pieces at $250. And to be honest, I think that's a pretty good deal, especially considering the AIO and power supply are already installed for you. For now, the NR200P MAX will be offered in this gray color, which I personally think looks really, really good, especially in person. It looks way more premium than the black or the white variants, which may be offered at a later date. But yeah, for me, this gray model is definitely what I would pick personally. But one of the reasons that you would choose the MAX over a standard NR200 or an NR200P is the fact that it does come in a kit, and that makes the building process a lot easier. So let's take a look at that. Alright, so the NR200P MAX is right over here. We'll get to that in a second, but I guess building in the case, the first thing that you want to do is grab this box here, which will be inside the case, of course. This will come with your PCIe 4.0 riser cable, a few other nice bits and pieces like your screws, some zip ties, but what we really want to start with here is the mounting hardware for the AIO. And of course, you have different mounting hardware here depending on whether you're building with Intel or AMD. In our case, we're building with Intel, so LGA 1200 socket. So let's take a look at what that process looks like. So we're going to grab the mounting bracket, peel these stickers off real quick, and then we're just going to line that up with the back of our motherboard, making sure that this top bit here lines with those two top screws. Then you want to press down firmly, make sure that adhesive sticks on. Then we have these little pieces here, which will go into the mounting bracket itself. And then you have these brackets here, which will be mounted directly to the pump block itself, which you can find right here pre-installed into the case. Now, these again will be different depending on whether you're going with Intel or AMD. These ones here are for the Intel build that we're doing for this build here. Now, one thing about this AIO that I just want to talk about really quick, the tubing is really, really long. So this looks like a custom made AIO for the NR200P MAX. So don't really mess around with the tubing or anything like that. I would actually just leave it how it is. The pump block itself kind of sits exactly where you want it to be, so there's no need to worry about tube routing or anything like that. Then in terms of installing these brackets, they are pretty straightforward. The screw positions will be located underneath the pump block, and make sure that the fold goes down. It is actually possible to install these upside down, but you do want to install it exactly like shown. So one bracket on the top, again, fold goes down, and then we'll just go ahead and install this second one here. Alright, awesome. So our cooler is ready for mounting here. We do have this protective film. We'll take that off later. And we're going to put our cooler to the side here, and we're going to install our motherboard. But before we do that, we just need to kind of organize these cables a little bit. And one thing I think Cooler Master could have done a little bit better here is just pre-routed the cables a little bit better. So we do have the CPU cable, 8-pin here, that is pre-routed already. That's really nice. But I really would have loved to see maybe a situation like the NZXT H1 where all of the cables are just sitting right above the plugs. So this 24-pin here and the GPU cables, we just have to kind of deal with those ourselves. But now that we've made some room here and untied those cables, we can drop in the motherboard, which should be pretty straightforward now. And yep, that seems to drop in there quite easily. At which point we can completely install it. Just locate these 4 screws, which will be in the box that we had a look at just earlier. All right, so motherboard is locked in there. Before we go and start, installing the GPU or making our life a little bit harder, we need to install these 3 tricky cables right here. So power switch and reset cable. We have our HD audio cable and then our front USB cable. So front USB first, pretty straightforward. It's going to be this one right here. Then we have our front panel power switch reset switch connector, which on our motherboard is right here. And on most motherboards will be on the right side near the 24 pin. Ours here is a little bit lower though. And then finally, the HD audio cable, which is located over here to the left. And to be honest, that's probably the hardest part over, is just managing those tiny little cables. But okay, now we got those done, we can install our liquid cooler. So a little bit of thermal paste. You will actually get a thermal paste tube in that cardboard box that we saw earlier. Won't be this one, but it'll be something very similar. And a nice small to medium application. Something like that should be perfectly fine. Then you want to grab these screws here, which we'll use to secure our pump block. And of course, one of the biggest mistakes that new builders make is not peeling this protective film off. If you leave this on, you are going to get very, very horrible thermal performance. So just put that off to the side. And then finally, we can go ahead and install it. All right, cool. So our cooler is completely ready to go, except for this little 3-pin header here. So no need to worry about SATA power or Molex power connections for our pump block, which is pretty cool. Just a simple 3-pin. So locate the pump header on our motherboard and then just simply plug that in. And then the next thing that we need to do is plug in our CPU 8-pin cable, which again is already pre-located at the top here. We do want to also plug in our motherboard 24-pin, and we also want to plug in these fan cables, which look like they're zip tied at the back here. We'll deal with those in a second, but yeah, those are the next 3 cables that we want to install. All right, so those cables are installed, and yeah, they were a little bit tedious, a little bit more tedious than I was expecting, but you know, just approach it with a little bit of patience and you won't get too annoyed. One thing that is a little bit annoying though is trying to manage all of these cables here, and one cool trick here in the Cooler Master NR200 is that if you flip it on its front here, you'll find this little screw right here, and this is going to make life a whole lot easier. So I think for the next few parts that we're going to be installing, we're just going to completely remove this bottom panel, especially when it comes to managing the cables. It's just going to make your life a whole lot easier. So what we're going to do is tip the case on the top. This bottom panel will just completely pop off now, which is really nice. And look at that. Now we have access to all of this cable junk right here, which we can just manage a whole lot easier. So really the only cables that we need from this whole mess here are going to be our PCIe cables for our GPU. So just kind of free those up here, put those to the side. But I mean, everything else here, the AIO tubes, the SATA cables, really everything else that you don't really need, you can just tightly pack that in and then just use the included Velcro tie downs just to manage that a little bit easier. Next up though, we need to install our graphics card, which the graphics card installation process is not like any other case that you've probably seen before. So we have basically this bracket here, which is what we're going to install our GPU on, and man, these screws are really stiff, so just keep that in mind. But basically there's 2 screws at the back here. Yep, those are locked in pretty well. Then we have another 2 screws here, one here and one over there. So yeah, installation process is pretty simple. We have some expansion slot brackets here, which we're just going to remove. Then we can slide the bracket over just like that, and then mount the bracket to the graphics card. Now, if you're using a graphics card as big as this, it's probably a good idea to plug in the connectors before you actually go ahead and install it, because if you can imagine something like this, and you've got a really tall graphics card, you know, plugging in these cables is going to be pretty much impossible. Another thing I'll mention is that, yeah, the NR200P MAX can handle a big graphics card, up to 336 mils in length and up to 160 mils in height, including the power connectors. So the one that we have here is the ROG Strix 6700 XT, comes in at 320 mils in length and about 140 mils in height, just as a bit of a size reference. So yeah, definitely a very big card, but should fit in here no problem. All right, so the power connectors are fitted to the massive Strix card that we have here, but something else that we need to pre-install before we actually put the graphics card in, again, just to make our life a little bit easier, is this PCIe Gen 4 riser cable. So we're just gonna simply slot that in here. I also just want to give a massive props to Cooler Master for including a Gen 4 PCIe riser cable and not doing the lazy and maybe easy thing to do, which would just be including a cheap Gen 3 riser cable. So with the Gen 4 cable, that means you're not going to have any compatibility issues with modern hardware, whereas with the Gen 3 cable, you most likely will run into some problems. And yeah, Gen 4 cable, super rigid as well, so it's a very high quality cable. These things are not cheap. Like if you wanted to buy one of these yourself, you'd probably be set back about like $80 US. So I think this is just another highlight of that, yeah, you are actually getting some really good value here. Now let's see how hard this thing is to actually install. The main problem here, our main difficulty I'll say, is just these cables at the back. But otherwise, it seems pretty straightforward. Seems like the bracket itself is slotted in nicely, so we can go ahead and screw that in. Then of course installing the riser cable, which we can just flip the case on its head here. Just make that a little bit easier. Very nice click there. And then finally, just these two screws here to complete the graphics card installation. And finally, let's talk about what your options are for mounting fans and stuff at the bottom here. So what you could do before in the NR200P or the NR200 was mount a bottom AIO. So you had about 55, 60 mils of clearance to play with. But now, since all of that clearance is at the top, the motherboard and graphics card mounting has been shifted down below, which means that you now have less clearance at the bottom. So even now, with just a pair of 25mm thick fans, hopefully you guys can see it is a little bit hard due to the lighting setup here, but basically this fan is hitting this riser cable, and so 25mm thick fans here are a no-go. Just swapping these out quickly for some slim Noctua fans, and really the installation process could not be easier. The bottom panel just goes straight on, and then you can secure it with the screw at the back. There's no clashing here now with the PCIe riser cable, which is really good to see. And now there's a little bit more breathing room between the cables and just everything that's positioned here at the bottom. And I really do think this is the way to go, having two slim fans at the bottom here, rather than just leaving this completely open. At least here now you do have a little bit of assisted airflow. Overall though, that is the entire build here done in the NR200P MAX. And the completed build looks pretty sick, if I do say so myself. There's just something about those gray panels that just bring the entire build together and makes it look really clean. But for now, let's talk about the performance. Most importantly, which of the two side panel options should you use? The tempered glass panel, which will show off your hardware better, or go for the performance approach with the vented panel? Well, we will take a look at performance, but just keep in mind that for the tempered glass setup, I've positioned the slim fans at the bottom as intake, whereas for the vented panel setup, they're positioned as exhaust. So with the built-in AIO fans and the bottom fans running at just 1100 RPM, performance is good overall when we take a look at the CPU temps. There's no massive difference between running the tempered glass setup versus the vented panel setup. Since the built-in CPU cooler is positioned as top exhaust, effectively cooling the radiator with the warm air within the case, CPU thermals aren't as good as what you can achieve with a side-mounted radiator in the original NR200. Having said that, the performance here is still more than acceptable for our overclocked 10900K, and I will mention that the NR200P MAX, especially in the vented setup, is pretty quiet overall. Where the NR200P MAX really exceeds though is when it comes to GPU performance. With graphics cards just getting bigger, hotter, louder, it's important that ITX cases can not only fit those powerful cards, but cool them effectively as well. Now we're only testing with a 2070 Super here, nothing crazy, but the performance here is really impressive. The performance actually beats the Fantex P500A mid tower by a couple of degrees, while also being a little bit quieter. Again, the setup here has the vertical GPU pulling air in through the side panels, and that heat is exhausted both at the top and bottom, and incredibly effective. The tempered glass setup is surprisingly okay too, but runs our 2070 Super about 5 degrees warmer. So what happens then when you install an RTX 3090 Founders Edition, 350 watts in a massive 3-slot form factor, the fastest GPU that you can buy today? Well, surprisingly, installation and fitment is pretty straightforward. The NR200P MAX is big enough to fit this card no problem. Just make sure that the flow-through fan isn't jammed up with any cables. But something really cool here is that even with a 3-slot card, there is a bit of a gap here between the card and the side panel, which means that even when you're running the tempered glass panel, performance is okay. The RTX 3090 was sitting at 70 degrees C, boosting to 1890 MHz, and running at a pretty typical fan speed of about 54%. With the vented panel setup though, we can run things a little bit quieter and cooler, shaving off 4 degrees C from our GPU temp, about 10% off of the fan speed, along with a slightly higher boost clock. So no doubt, vented is the way to go for performance, but tempered glass is viable even with a giant graphics card, and I will admit it does look pretty good. So performance wise, the NR200P MAX really can't be faulted, and I think moving forward with graphics cards just getting bigger and louder and hotter, I think this is probably like a top 3 ITX case moving forward. It is a bit on the bigger side, but the reason I say that is because, if you are considering these massive GPUs, these ITX cases, they are getting harder and harder to fit them, but not only fit them, but cool them effectively as well. Even with a big Strix card like this, fitment is absolutely no problem, and cooling is just not something that you have to even think about. Vertical GPU performance, surprisingly, is even better than the vertical GPU setup in the original NR200P, and that is surprising to me, but that mostly seems due to the graphics card being shifted closer to the middle of the case. There's more of a gap between the side panel, and the top and bottom fans can work more efficiently around the graphics card cooler design. I also do think that as a kit, this is pretty future-proof. I mean, the 850 watt power supply will handle any single GPU setup for the foreseeable future, and the 280mm AIO has no problems keeping the 10900K under control, even with an overclock in heavy workloads like Blender. If you are interested in picking it up, I will leave it linked down below in the description. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.